Now, we are lucky today. We have Mark Dierolf. Mark is a nationally recognized water treatment expert and the owner and CEO of Dierolf Plumbing and Water Treatment. He's one of our affiliate members, so we thank you, Mark, for being an affiliate member. He has over 30 years experience and as a longtime water quality is, I'm sorry, he has over 30 years experience and he's a longtime Water Quality Association member. He helps homeowners and real estate professionals navigate water regulations and system design. Under his leadership, Dierolf Plumbing and Water Treatment has supported thousands of real estate transactions, ensuring that homes meet safety and compliance standards. He also owns Weiss Choice Business Coaching and is a business and is a phenomenal business coaching franchisee, mentoring small business owners. Before we have Mark speak, we have another one of our affiliates, and she's going to give a 2-minute information about her company. And we have Cindy Seener. She's a licensed loan officer with Guild Mortgage. She is licensed in PA, New Jersey, Delaware, and Florida. She's been a loan officer for over 6 years, and she's dedicated to helping individuals and families achieve their homeownership dreams. She specializes in home mortgages, refinancing, and personal loans. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Cindy, for a couple minutes, and then Mark will go right to you. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lisa, for having me today. So yes, hi, everybody. I am Cindy Seener. I'm a licensed loan officer with Guild Mortgage. So just to give you a little background about Guild, we have been around since 1960 as Guild. We started off in the West Coast and we're in the last 4 or 5 years been coming over into the East Coast, making a footprint here. We are nationwide with a small bank feel. So that just means my ops team is local and centralized to my location here. I have an assistant that I work with who was an underwriter for 15 years. So it's kind of nice before we submit our files. We always like to submit a very clean file and sort of pre-underwrite it before it goes to underwriting. We have all of the standard loan products here, but we also have solutions to fit outside of the box situations, such as renovation loans, reverse mortgages, bank statement loans, and internal DSCR loans for investors. I personally host many events throughout the year, especially lunch and learns, just to bring people together, provide additional value to my partners, and allow others to meet and collaborate as well. So I would love to invite you all throughout the year. So please, if you see me at any of the Bucks breaks, or if you're going to be there this Thursday, come say hi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And Cindy, please feel free to put your contact info into the chat in case anybody on here wants to contact you. And now we're going to turn it over to you. Thanks, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. How are you this morning? I guess it's officially afternoon. Appreciate you all being here this morning. I'm going to cover some details on well and water and how they impact the real estate industry. And just a quick on myself, as she had said, I've been in the business for a very long time. I do a lot of training classes in real estate. This is probably the one thing that I'm still involved in completely in my company is real estate. I started my business specifically to help with real estate agents. So one other quick thing, the phenomenal business coaching that I have, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Zig Ziglar, but we're the exclusive small business coach for the Zig Ziglar Corporation. So we do a really good job on some of those trainings as well. So looking forward to this morning. I'll share my screen with everybody, assuming we can see it okay. There we go. So we're going to cover some current trends in real estate for water and well. That's what we're going to cover this morning. And you can ask questions if you have questions. Love answering questions, whatever I can help you with. If you have a project or a deal you're working on and you need some help. I would also suggest if you keep some notes of what you're looking to have answered, I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end because there's usually a good series of questions when I make these presentations. So looking forward to this again, and we'll get started. So I want to start with the basics in real estate. One of the most common things you'll find in water testing in real estate is coliform bacteria. And I always start with the basics and work my way through because there's so many things we're going to try to cover this morning. And I always tell people I'm very cautious when I go through this, very conservative when we do testing and remediation. And mainly it's because I'm very allergic to liability, and I suggest you should be as well. So we'll start with coliform and go through the process. Coliform is something that you'll have show up in many well tests. Between 34 and 50% of wells test positive for coliform in the mid-Atlantic region, depending on your location. So coliform bacteria is very common. And I always tell people, especially if they're moving from public water to well water, to understand that the reason public water is chlorinated is because they're concerned about a coliform bacteria issue in the water. So it's very common. If you have a private well, the solution for coliform is a lot better than chlorine because there's other methods we can use to fix it that aren't quite as invasive as the chlorine. But just to connect people that are moving from public water to well water and quell some concerns, that's the first thing I tell them about coliform. So not to be super concerned. We test for it and it's easy to solve. The next big item that's become more prevalent in our marketplace is arsenic. The main reason arsenic has become a much bigger issue is simply because a number of years ago, they changed the limit on arsenic from 50 parts per billion to 10. And when that change took place, it made a dramatic difference in the marketplace and what you're seeing in water tests. So, and you have to remember, when we're testing water to a particular standard. That standard is called the MCL, maximum contaminant level, that's set by the EPA. What most people don't realize is that the EPA has a second standard called, instead of just maximum contaminant level, it's MCLG, which stands for maximum contaminant level goal, meaning if you were to take economics out of the picture, what they would set that limit to. You got to remember, all of these limits are set with economics in mind. So, and I always ask people, how much arsenic do you want in your water? That's one of the questions I ask. So even if you pass, sometimes those are the questions. And again, for real estate, we certainly won't go down that road. But just so you know, as customers have a concern, we'll get into some other areas of concern, but that's a big one. And then a third one is lead. Lead has been a big challenge all along, but the particular issue in Flint, Michigan, a number of years ago really brought a spotlight to lead in drinking water, and it caused a lot of consumers to be really concerned. So lead is another one. If you do an FHA test, a basic FHA test, you'll get your coliform, you'll get your E. coli, and you'll get your lead, and you'll get nitrate. You won't get arsenic in your basic package, though. And I suggest most people consider testing for that. It's very prevalent in our marketplace. So that's starting out with just the basics. I want to give you a slide that gives you a better picture of that, just so you can get an idea. This is a study that was done, and you can see the percentages of wells that fail for coliform bacteria, E. coli, nitrate, lead, arsenic. The last one that I want to point out is pesticides. You run into pesticides a whole lot as a real estate agent in well testing. People ask about them all the time. They're worried because they're spraying their lawn. But you can see on the chart how little pesticides really are found in well water. There's a number of reasons for that. Some of that's well construction. If your surface water enters your well, you've got bigger problems than just pesticides. That's generally the only way pesticides would generally get in there. If you have a surface water problem, these things are certainly possible, but you can see on a level of pass fail, it's low on the list. So I want to point that out. You get those questions a lot. We can certainly test for them. Pesticides are challenging. That's the reason I pointed out, simply because you can do a pesticide. There's thousands of pesticides. That's one of the biggest problems in our industry. Thousands, and they're all very specific chemistries that you would need to test for. So pesticides get tough to give a full array of pesticide testing. When people spend a lot of money on it, they think they're getting that, but they're really just getting the 20 or 30 most popular pesticides. It's not an all-inclusive test. So those are some things to just be aware of as people ask this. And the other thing is, as I go through this process, when you have customers with questions, that's what we're experts at. We certainly want to help your clients answer any of those questions. You don't have to feel like you're going to need to become an expert in this. You have to be an expert in so many different things in your industry. Thank goodness for me, I only have to be an expert at this. That makes it pretty easy to be very up to date on what's happening in this particular industry. So we're here to help you do those things. So the other thing I want to point out in the beginning as we talk about water testing and collection is one of the other studies that was done, a pretty intense study, was bias sampling from method and location, because you're going to hear over time, this has happened, I've been doing this 30 years, hasn't happened a lot, but once or twice a year, somebody says, hey, you didn't collect the sample properly. And that's why it failed. These are typically sellers who are sure they have great water, even though they haven't tested it in 30 years. So they did a big study on this for bias testing, and they found out that basically, in a nutshell, I'm going to summarize it for you. There's no statistical difference whether you collect with or without an aerator. If I collect it from the kitchen sink or the well tank, there's no statistical difference in bacteria being found in the water one way or the other. I think it's just very important to point out to you, because sometimes you'll have that question come up. We obviously collect to a standard, but even if that sample were not collected to that standard by a third party, again, there's virtually no statistical difference in pass-fail. So I always like to point that out, because occasionally I'll get the realtor who has an expert client and they're sure that something wasn't done right. So we have studies that help support some of this stuff as well. That'll help support you. Now, this is where we get into more of the nuts and bolts and what we've got going on in our industry today. So the biggest emerging contaminants you're going to see are these things that are listed on here that we might not have talked about before quite as much. PFOAs and PFOS, simply you're going to hear talked about more. They'll call them microplastics. That's probably one of the big terms, or forever chemicals. You'll hear that. It's taking on major press coverage. It's a big issue. I'm going to get into some of the details of it later, but it's a big issue. Another one is radionuclei like radon, radium. So radon in water is a real challenge from a real estate standpoint, and I want to touch on that quickly. I have been asked more and more over the last few years to do radon in water, and we do that. We have a company that we partner with that's excellent with radon. This is the biggest challenge with radon in water. Unlike radon in air, radon in water is unregulated in your industry. So you might have a client who wants to test for it, and you can't tell a client not to test for something. I've learned that long ago. You have to let the client choose what they want to test for. And even if they ask me for suggestions, I give them a list to pick from, simply because, like I said earlier, I'm very allergic to liability, and you should be too. If you specifically guide or direct your customer and they find out later there's something else there, you know as well as I do, you'll get blamed for it. So it's better to let the customer make these decisions, and they can have that in collaboration with us to do those things. But I will always provide a list. So radionuclei is the biggest problem. Radon's unregulated in water. So even if you're going to get a result, the question is, what does that result mean? So it makes it challenging when somebody asks for a radon test for a real estate transaction. So I always explain to the client that I can collect a sample, I can get them a result, but I'm not sure what that result's going to do for them in the transaction. If it's for their own need or their own use, that's fine. But transactionally, it'd be very difficult to ask a seller to fix radon because there's no limit. So it'd be difficult to say if it passed or failed. It just creates a challenge. Not like you don't have enough challenges in real estate. And then the next one is pharmaceuticals in the water supply. That's primarily public water supply. So we don't do much real estate testing in public water for public water supplies, but in the last handful of years, we've done more of it than we had ever done in the previous 25 years combined. So more and more people are doing it. And that's because that's where the Flint, Michigan thing came into play. It was public water, not well water. So pharmaceuticals are found in drinking water, and they're being found primarily in public water that's surface water driven. So if your water is driven from a river or a stream where a wastewater treatment plant is going to dump into, and that's where you're taking your water from, that's where you'll find pharmaceuticals. That's something you'll hear about occasionally. And then the last one I mentioned is manganese, because manganese used to be linked with iron as just something that'll cause staining. Manganese can cause black or very dark brown staining. But they have found that manganese is not just a stainer, it's actually linked to some significant health concerns, and those health concerns are dementia and Alzheimer's. So manganese is linked to those two things, and the DEP and the EPA are now testing public water systems much more frequently for manganese. So that's one of the tests that we include in our 10-point gold package. It's the manganese. So very important to understand those things about water. And this again just gives you some details on the health effects of manganese and so on and so forth. I won't read this slide word for word, but rest assured, manganese has been connected to health issues. So we're starting to take it more seriously as not just a stainer, but as a health concern. So now I want to get into the to the update on PFOAs, PFOSs. These are your microplastics, your forever chemicals. And this is, so these things have been around for a long time, but they've become very newsworthy or just over the last few years. In fact, even going to national events, we haven't really talked about them on the national level for more than a handful of years in my industry. And they've really gotten to be hot in the last 2 years. So March 14th, 2023 is when the EPA announced their proposed national primary drinking water regulation for PFAs. This is really important because it was unregulated before. Now it's going to be regulated. And there's a lot of challenges with PFOAs. There's a study I'll show you briefly about PFOAs and how they're connected. But 84% of consumers are definitely concerned about PFOAs, PFOSs in their water. It's really important. So the proposal consisted both of enforcing maximum contaminant levels and non-enforceable levels. So water quality is who the WQA is. The Water Quality Association has submitted documents to help support this. The bottom line is in 2026, this is set to go into action where they're going to start monitoring PFOAs and PFOSs in drinking water. Right now, it's a fairly expensive test. I think as we get further into this, that dollar for that test will come down because more labs will get involved in testing, and that'll drive competition, which will lower the price on PFOAs and PFOSs. But it's something you're going to begin to hear a lot about because consumers are really concerned about it. I mean, this is a summary slide. This was written by a gentleman, his name's Mike Sheffield. He's a senior technical writer for NSF. NSF sets standards for just about everything, including water filtration systems. And they've done a lot of studies on these microplastics. And you can see at the bottom of the study, a 2024 study found that 84% of respondents were either somewhat or very concerned about microplastics. So this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue in our marketplace. It is solvable. We're new as an industry into it. We're constantly looking for better ways, but there are solutions to solve the problem. So, and I say this sincerely, I've in all my years, I've never really run across water we couldn't fix. It's just at what cost to do those types of things. So keep those things in mind as we go through. And this was just a study on PFOAs on what they call POET. So POET is just an abbreviation. It stands for point of entry treatment. That means when the water's coming into your house, that's point of entry. So this was an article in Washington, the state of Washington. But at the end, the main thing is it impacted a homeowner. There was a homeowner trying to sell her home. She was having trouble. She put a POET system in and then problem solved. She was able to sell the home because, again, 84% of consumers are really concerned about PFOAs. If you have a solution already in place for it, it's actually become a selling point, as crazy as that can be. Water is really important. So those are some really, really big things to keep in mind with this is an emergent contaminant. We're going to learn more about it over the coming years, but you will, if you haven't already heard about it, you certainly will. And then I'll just make a brief comment on public water testing before I get into wells themselves. Public water testing, it's not just wells, but how does it affect you, public water testing? Some clients are starting to ask real estate agents to test the public water. So obviously, like I said earlier on, you don't want to try to talk somebody out of doing something that they want to do. That can certainly be come back to hurt you later on. But how does it impact you? It's just making sure you're dealing with somebody who's telling that client the whole truth. We can test. I just did one in the city of Philadelphia. You can test for public water, but I convey to the client, I can do this test, but I'm not sure what you're going to do with it, because if it's public water, the seller is going to basically say, hey, that's public water. There's not much I can do for it. So you're doing this more for your own purposes. And when you have that conversation with a client, most of the time on a common sense level, you can begin to communicate that message. And I know I'm always careful with the term common sense. My auto mechanic told me many years ago, it's rare sense, it's not common anymore, but we do our best. So how does that affect you? The effect is basically it's very difficult to negotiate it. So as long as you're explaining, or as long as you're using us and we're explaining to that customer what the value of that test is and what they can do with it, that's helpful. Most of the sources of public water, they can either be surface water. We talked about that earlier with the pharmaceuticals, lakes, streams, rivers, or they can be very deep well systems. Many communities get their public water off a series of very deep drilled wells. And those deep drilled wells can have contaminants in them too. So those public water utilities have to comply regardless. Typically, you'll see some differences between surface water and well water in your public water supply. For example, one of the key impacts of deep well water versus surface water is calcium magnesium, or water hardness. Usually well water is much harder than surface water sources. Not always, but that's the tendency. Much more common to have lead issues on public water systems, not necessarily because they're not treating the water properly, but we have extremely old distribution systems in our country, and those distribution systems have a lot of lead connections, and those lead connections will pick up the water. Water is the universal solvent. It'll dissolve everything over time. So if it's running through piping that's older, it'll pick up some lead in that piping. Same thing it'll do in your home. If your home has plumbing that's older than 2015, it's probably going to have lead fittings in it. Even if it's PEX, the house still has fixtures that are not PEX. Those fixtures are lead and brass, are copper and brass, and if they're old enough, they'll still have lead sources in them. So, and of course, we spoke about pharmaceuticals and PFOAs and PFOSs. So that's a general summary of testing, of the various things you'll run into nowadays on testing, and some of the questions you might run into and be aware of. Now, when we begin to move on to the well part of it itself, residential wells, the first thing I want you to know about the well, a private well, when we talk about private wells, I'm sure you're very familiar if you have if you have a residential home that has septic and a private well, you know, you're very well aware of septic. As soon as you hear septic, most people shudder. But private wells sometimes do the same thing to clients because they're not used to it. There's a couple of things I tell our clients. First thing I tell them is 65% of my treatment business is on public water. We sell more treatment systems to people with public water than we do private wells. That's usually eye-opening when you begin to make that statement. But there's one thing to understand about residential private wells in the real estate industry. There are no federal or state rules or regulations governing private wells. That's the first thing you should really make sure you understand. There's no federal or state rules or regulations for private wells. There's a downside to that. The downside to that is obvious. You can hang a shingle out tomorrow and you're a water or well expert. We do have certifications because we do work on public systems for the DEP and the EPA, but you don't have to have those things to work in the residential area. So just be aware who you're working with and if they have the credentials you really want. The other challenge with that is when you do a well inspection, since there's no federal or state rules or regulations, the well inspection becomes instead of a pass-fail, it becomes something a little different than pass-fail. Typically on a well inspection report, instead of saying pass-fail, we're going to say it's the term I'm looking for. I'm sorry, it escapes me, but we're going to use a different terminology rather than pass-fail. It's going to either be acceptable or unacceptable, basically, is how we're going to word that. And when we come up with unacceptable, we typically use a standard. Chester County has a regulation. There's only a few counties in Pennsylvania that have regulations for new wells when you drill a new well. And Chester County has one of the strictest standards, so we typically use that. And it's not a super hard standard. It's their standard is 4 gallons a minute for 2 hours, which is 480 gallons. So if your well is producing less than 4 gallons a minute, it's possible that it could become unsatisfactory instead of satisfactory. That's typically how we look at it. So, and we talked about it before, wells are utilized for public systems as well. They're regulated by either the Department of Environmental Protection or the Pennsylvania State Board of Health. Those are a couple of things with wells that you can understand on the public side. And then private wells, like I said, they're only regulated in a handful of counties. So just something to be aware about with private wells and what you're looking for when somebody's performing a well inspection. What we're looking for is we're looking to make sure a family can live on that well. Very few wells that we test will be considered unsatisfactory, but occasionally you do run into them. And to drill a new well is somewhere between $16,000 and $20,000. So it's a big deal if there's a well issue. Not quite as big as septic, but it's certainly getting up there now with the cost to drill new wells. And in particular counties like Chester and Bucks, where the regulations are a little tougher on new wells, it gets to be a little bit more expensive. So just something to be aware of. On pump and pump sizing, when we do well inspections, we're looking to see how a pump is sized. Sometimes the language in pump sizing can be very misleading. So we try to make sure we assess all of that for you. The most common types of well pumps are submersible well pumps. They're in the ground, you don't see them. And then the second type of pump you'll see a lot of is a shallow well or a jet pump. And they'll either be two pipe or on single pipe or two pipe. Single pipe wells are usually only about 15 or 20 feet deep, 25 feet max. And then two pipe jet pumps, if the well pump is actually in the basement of the house or in the crawl space of the house, that's what a submersible shallow well jet pump is. A two pipe pump could be as deep as 80 feet. So they're typically considered more shallow wells in the industry. And they're not that they're not acceptable. They certainly are. And some of them produce great amounts of water. So the type of pump isn't critical. It's just knowing the difference. So and then pump sizing, as I said earlier, can be a bit confusing. So understanding how the pump sizing works and how they're manufactured certainly helps. And we go into all of those things with our clients as they ask. So I just want to show you a basic diagram, and I have a number of them in here. There's actually one that's better than this one that I'm going to show you after this, but you can see there's several different types of wells. But if you can see on this picture that I'm showing, there's a water table level, okay? And then there is an unconfined or upper level aquifer, and then there's a confinement layer, and then a confined or artesian lower level aquifer. Obviously, the deeper your well, the more you're going to get into that lower level aquifer. And when you do that, there's a greater chance that you'll avoid some surface contaminations from getting into your well. It doesn't mean you're going to drill a deeper well and get better water. In fact, sometimes when you drill deeper, you can find some of the major contaminants more abundantly, like arsenic and so on and so forth, can be found in a deeper well. So the essence of this is depth really isn't as critical as you think it is. Does the well produce enough water to live on? Most times, the reason you're going to drill a deeper well is because that column of water, and I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, I don't know if that shows up for you, but the column of water on a particular well is storage for capacity. So every foot of storage, the depth of that well, every foot is about 1.4 gallons of water, a little less than a gallon and a half. So in other words, if you have a 300-foot deep well and your pump is sitting at the bottom, which it usually wouldn't, but just for terms, let's say it's sitting at 300 feet, and you have your static water, your resting water level at 100 feet below the surface, that means you have 200 feet of water sitting in there. And that means you have roughly 300 gallons, 280 to 300 gallons of water stored in that column. So just when you're doing these well inspections, it helps. Now, it doesn't mean you need that. The reason typically you have that is because it's a lower yielding well, meaning the well fills a lot slower. That's why you might have a deeper well. Again, not always, but it's fairly common. Some of your upper level, surface level wells, those types of wells can produce an abundance of water and never run out. I have one in Washington Crossing at the Flower Preserve. It's only 135 feet deep, but it produces 50 gallons a minute. It's just a fantastic well. So, and then the last thing I'll show is there's the potential for a flowing artesian well. A flowing artesian well, you'll find they're capped in different ways. But they're literally wells that have, if there's no cap at all, the water just pours out of them all the time. So, so those are potentials, and that's all based on where the water level is. You can see in the water level picture, you can see that there's, and I think the next picture does it better. This one here really shows it really well. You can see what's called the static water level going across the drawing. If it's below the top of the well, you could have a flowing artesian well, because that's the resting level of water. And if you've drilled your well and it's below that, it'll actually run out over the top. So just something to be aware of when you're talking about wells with houses. I think people that are coming from public water are probably more nervous about wells than they should be, private wells. So, and I think this helps understand that, and building that picture for a client can be helpful. Because some of your best homes are going to be on private wells. We do a lot of work in Bucks County and Washington Crossing and New Hope and all of those areas, and that's all primarily well. So something to be aware of there. And again, I have several different pictures in here on these types of wells, what they look like, how they're drilled. I don't want to bore you with a lot of those details, but here's a picture where you can see just how a well system is set up. I think it helps you understand what a well system is. You've got your this well particularly is drilled into a lower level, the aquifer. It's got what they call the gravel level aquifer, so it has some built-in filtration. It has the well screening where the water enters the well. Then you have your pump sitting in a cased area. That casing gets into that rock area that we talked about earlier, so that doesn't allow surface water to get down into that lower level aquifer. So you have some cleaner water typically. And then you can see there's something at the top that's called a pitless adapter. That's where the well pump, a submersible pump, is hung on that. And then that line leads into the pressure tank, which is in your house. So those are all well components, and you want them all to be working together. When we do a well inspection, we make sure all of those components are working the way they should. And this picture just shows the different levels that you can find water near Earth's surface. So you have your an unconfined aquifer, then you have a confined aquifer that takes years. This is where the misnomer gets into play. When somebody's worried about, I just sprayed my yard with pesticides, or my neighbor just sprayed their yard with pesticides, I'm worrying about them being in my well. If you're in your confined aquifer, it's going to be years before that's going to get down into that aquifer. So testing for it, right after it happened is really not going to help you one bit. And if you're deep enough, like a lot of public water wells could be 4,000 or more feet deep, now you're in a confined aquifer that takes centuries for surface level water to get to. So it's just a protection against those types of water and so on and so forth. So those are some things I want you to know of. And you can see there's fractured rock, there's gravel-based type aquifers you can get into. As you can see in the drawing, there's surface water, groundwater that you can get into. So depending on the depth of the well will depend on the type of contaminant you might find in that well. So, and then how well issues arise, there's a number of things that can go wrong. You can have a broken riser pipe, your pump can fail. There's so many different things that can go wrong over the course of time. That's why you do the inspections. Typically a drilled well, though, lasts for many, many years if they're done properly. So, and again, that's just another picture of the various levels and so on and so forth. So water testing, to sum it up, private use water testing is driven first by need. Real estate, mortgage companies drive the testing that's required. So you have to first understand, when you're setting up these testings and inspections, very few mortgages will require a well inspection. Most of them will require a water test. The FHA, USDA, depending on your underwriter, will drive those tests. But after that, it's really the consumer or your customer, if you're a buyer's agent, who really drives what they're going to test for. We just got to make sure that we're testing at a minimum what their mortgage company requires. And again, there's not a lot of requirements anymore. They're lowering those requirements, frankly. So geography plays a key role in what you test for. We know there are certain contaminants that are more prevalent in one area than another. Public water testing in real estate is becoming more common. Just to sum that up, what to look for there. Don't necessarily push somebody away from it, again, because that could become your problem later. I wouldn't suggest you promote it, but if they ask, we can certainly do it. And then the last thing is different seasons can affect results because you can get a change in the water table, and that can sometimes impact the type of results. It's rare, but occasionally you can get pH fluctuations from one season to another and those types of things. So those are all some important things to be aware of as we go through this. And then from my company's standpoint, we provide a number of services. I started my business serving the real estate industry. So we do water testing, well testing and well inspections. We do water system design and installation. So we actually design treatment systems and install them to fix the water properly. We have fully licensed master plumbers on staff, and we have a real estate specific team or approach to dealing with these things. Mainly because in your world, you live on a timeline with everything you do, and we know those timelines are important. So we do everything we can to meet those timelines, or at least give you an honest answer as to what that timeline will be. There's nothing worse than somebody telling you, yeah, we'll get it done in that timeline, and it doesn't happen. It's better to know the truth up front, and we'll do that for you. So that gives you a little bit of information on my company. I'm going to go through a couple of quick slides here so I can get to questions and answers for you. If not, there's a few other things I'd be glad to cover, but I wanted to make sure I give you plenty of time to get the questions answered that you want to answer. So who has my first question?